you because we've just concluded our season on Judas Priest versus Iron Maiden in our narrative Battle of the Bands podcast. And I figured who best to talk to other than someone who's actually penned about half a dozen books on both Maiden and Priest, not one book, but like 12, which is pretty impressive. And, I'm an author myself. And when I tell people that I've written a few books, they ask how many? And I say 5. They're like, wow, 5 books. That's a lot. And I'm like, yeah. Have you heard of Martin Popoff? He's published 110 and counting. And just a fascinating story. So we'll get to Priest and Maiden today, but I'd love to just, wind the tape back a bit, Martin, and kind of deep dive into your sort of origin story with metal. When did you start getting into, rock and roll and heavy metal? As someone who was born in 63, I imagine it might have been in the mid 70s sometime.
Yeah, definitely. I just turned 60 a couple weeks ago. So birthday. I would say it was 1972, 73. I would have been 9 years old, 10 years old. So got in pretty early. And me and a few buddies from town, we definitely got to be experts pretty fast. But in 73, I can remember getting like Nazareth Razamanaz, BTO's first album. I definitely got Kiss's first album as a new release, Rush's first album as a new release. So 74, 75, it's ramping up. This is the heyday of Kiss and Aerosmith and Ted Nugent and all that. Yeah. And first big concert was Dad took me and my brother and a buddy down to Spokane, Washington, the big city, and we saw Ted Nugent, supported by Rex and Bebop Deluxe. Yeah. And I guess before that there was the Columbia Record Club, and got a few things like Steppenwolf and Three Dog Night and CCR, and then realized love the heavy stuff. The odd older cousin and older brother of a buddy had some records and stuff. So yeah, I was full on Sabbath, Deep Purple at that point. Blue Oyster Cult, off to the races, and definitely by 11 years old, we were fanatics.
Yeah, there's always an older brother or cousin or something. In my case, it was an older brother-in-law who had just married my sister in like 1997. I was 13 at the time, and accessed his back catalog of magazines and records and CDs. And very quickly, I got into Maiden and Motley Crue and Gunners. And by the end of the decade, I went from like listening to Motley Crue and, Poison to In Flames and even like melodic death metal out of Sweden. It was a very rapid ascendancy, kind of like yourself. It like progressively gets heavier and heavier as you go along.
Yeah. Well, back then there just wasn't that much heavy stuff. So literally up until the start of the new wave of British heavy metal, there's, handfuls, a couple, 3 dozen, 4 dozen, 5 dozen at the most sort of heavy metal albums out there in the world. Right. So, absolutely. And then the hockey stick, right? It takes off.
Absolutely. I mean, you had your Motorheads, and then the thrash metal scene out of 81, 82 just absolutely exploded. And that's when you really got to heavy metal music, and obviously the new wave of British heavy metal as well. But in terms of that, like heavy bang your head, that kind of really took off out of San Francisco, I guess one might say.
Yeah. We call that, Steve? We call that the start of metal. There was heavy metal before that for quite a while, but then Kill 'Em All, July 1983, that's the beginning of metal.
Yeah, and that's an interesting distinction. So with respect to your career, I mean, having penned 110 books, and this isn't having penned 110 books since 1973 when you were 10, this is over the past 30 years. So you're basically averaging somewhere between 3 to 4 books a year. As someone who's penned several hundred articles and 5 books myself, and no doubt we have a lot of musicians in our audience who listen and pen songs themselves, I'd love to just take a sneak peek into your sort of creative process. Like when you're sitting down from woe to go, writing a book, do you like lock yourself in a room for X numbers of hours a day, get into the flow state, no distractions, which is what a lot of authors do? What's your process look like, Martin?
Yeah, I mean, there's a ton of ways to answer that, but to net it out and directly answer your question, I would say, okay, I've learned over time that I've got my productive hours, which are sort of 7:30 in the morning till noon. And then as I tell people, my IQ starts dropping off 10 points an hour starting at noon, right? The other thing that I try to do, because every book is sort of different, there's different concepts and you know how they're put together, long ones, short ones, blah blah blah, deadlines. What I tend to do is it is a good idea to get in a focus. Don't let too many days go by before you go back and play with it again, sort of thing. So once I'm on one, you know, you try to throw a lot of hours at it to make sure that critical mass is going, that you know you remembered how to spell the mob rules versus mob rules, and you spell rock and roll the same way, and every time, you know what I mean? Like all the, and you know what quotes you've used where, whatever. I got a whole process for that too, with like chop files and chopping down quote files. And but yeah, it's you want to stay on it. I'm usually not doing 2 books at the same time. Sometimes I have to, but generally it's a pretty linear thing where you're just doing one at a time.
Absolutely. And it's funny what you said about spelling rock and roll the same every time. I try to do like the apostrophe and the N, rock, apostrophe N, roll. And it's kind of like with Guns and Roses as well. You can't do Guns and Roses. It's like Guns and Roses. So it's these
Capital
little
N apostrophe.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, it takes a while to learn all that stuff. I couldn't tell you right now. I just wrote a Kiss book. You know, I've followed Kiss ever since day one. Off the top of my head, I can't remember how to spell rock and roll all night, you know, properly. And there's so many of those. There's tons and tons and tons of those, right? Like who's a Devin Townsend versus Pete Townsend? You know, how do you spell those? How do you spell Peter Tagdren? You know, from Hypocrisy, and just millions of those.
Devin Townsend, a little different to Phil Townsend.
Yeah. And, you know, that's why big publishers put together style sheets, right? They get your editor and they put together a whole style sheet and I never do that. It's a good thing to do, but lay out a whole way you do that. You know, when to go apostrophe 60 S versus the possessive 60 apostrophe S, and don't put, you know, comma S and all of that stuff, right?
Yeah.
How do you spell out your numbers? You know, I tend to spell out my numbers 1 to 10 and then go into numerals, and then half my publishers just change it all back anyways, you know, to something else. So
well, that's the beauty of having a publisher and someone editing your work and just fixing up all that sort of stuff for you, so you can focus on the meat on the bone, essentially, which is the story. And speaking of stories, you know, the battle between 2 new wave of British heavy metal titans over the past 45 odd years has been a fascinating one to watch. And of course, Priest got their start in the mid 70s and were, you know, 4 albums in by the time Maiden came along with their self-titled album in 1980. What was your sort of first exposure to these bands like? And, you know, when did you first see either Maiden or Priest live, Martin?
Wow, my first exposure to Priest was getting Sad Wings as a new release, and it just blowing our minds. Like you'd sit at the kitchen table making your top 10 lists of everything, and it just rose to the top of everything. They just seemed like geniuses, and I've said to this day that was the first actual big improvement in heavy metal since 1970, all the way up to 1976. And then got Mail Order Rock-a-Rolla, and then got Sin After Sin as a new release, and on and on. Maiden was kind of the same situation where, you know, we're going down to Spokane, Washington on these record buying trips to the cool head shop record stores that would get in the imports. And I got, you know, the debut as a new release. Never owned a Soundhouse tapes, but the debut, and you're buying Sounds magazine and all that. This before Kerrang, right? You know, all that metal stuff was in Sounds for 2 or 3 years before Kerrang actually started, right? But yeah, got all that as new releases. And I actually didn't see a lot of concerts when I was a kid, but oddly enough, Maiden and Priest were 2 of the first ones, because again, both of those were trips to Spokane. And I think, Maiden would have been 83. So I saw Maiden headlining over Saxon, headlining over Fastway.
Was that the Peace of Mind tour?
Yep. That would have been that. Yep. And then Priest was on Screaming for Vengeance with, I think it was Coney Hatch supporting.
Excellent. And I know Maiden did support Priest on the World of Vengeance tour for a number of dates. And I remember reading a story about Paul Diano in the lead up to one of these gigs saying that Maiden were going to blow the bollocks off Priest. And it's a funny anecdote, because Rob Halford years later would tell a journalist that, well, and it might have been in your book even, that he took that a little too literally. And he thought, well, I'm going to get him drunk. And they went back to Rob Halford's room, Paul Di'Anno and Rob Halford. But the way Halford puts it, he was too drunk to try anything. And Paul Di'Anno was too drunk to know what Halford wanted to try.
Oh, wow. I've never heard that story.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. He said, it's probably for the best. Nothing happened. I think that's absolutely true. But that is probably, Paul Di'Anno saying that Maiden were going to blow the bollocks of Priest is one of the earliest sort of documented examples of sort of this rivalry between these two bands heating up. I mean, what are some sort of junctures in this relationship between Maiden and Priest that you think come to mind when it comes to their sort of rivalry brewing over the years, Martin?
Well, let's see. Could you just talk for a second? I'm just hoping I didn't. I got a very
testing 1, 2, 3.
Just turn you down a little. Okay, that's fine. So the rivalry. So the rivalry. What I find interesting about the rivalry. So let's say, that's a really interesting question. I've never been asked that. So I guess the first interesting juncture of a clash would be the excitement level of a young band coming up and Priest also doing the best business they ever would do. Mm-hmm. So there's the excitement level at British Steel versus Iron Maiden. And then I guess there's a different sort of excitement level 2 albums later for both of them. So when you've got the likes of 1982 and Priest has faltered a little with Point of Entry, but they're coming back with a vengeance, with Screaming for Vengeance, and Maiden is on the ascendance, and they've got Bruce Dickinson. Now you've got 2 bands that probably can do pretty much the same sort of business, although Priest was still selling a lot more albums and more tickets, actually, probably still at that point. But at that point, you're starting to almost see that like this baby band is pretty exciting and they're like the next Priest. So then after that, they have a bizarrely parallel world for years and years and years, right? And there's no real competition between them, I don't think, or where you want to sort of say certain things match up. But the next point where things sort of match up, I think, on a competition level is when Maiden starts selling more and more tickets and Priest sort of stays the same size. And both of them, I'm talking in like literally the 2000s now at this point, right? So we're say Brave New World and Angel of Retribution, and now they're both putting out albums. Bruce is back, Rob is back. So at this point, what happens is Maiden gets the leg up by just becoming this legendary band that everybody loves a lot and loves more and more, and they sell tons of tickets and they sell out places. Whereas Priest stays at that small hockey barn, got to be on a package bill, maybe large theaters. Yeah. And neither are selling very many records. So there's pretty much a parallel there. But yeah, at that point, starting around, I would say Matter of Life and Death, the ball kind of gets rolling. So what do we got? Brave New World. So there's Dance of Death next. So maybe it starts picking up a Dance of Death, and the ball starts rolling and Maiden sort of takes over. So now we've had basically almost 20 years of Maiden being the undisputed bigger band of the two.
Yeah, it's interesting how that happened. And I mentioned this in the podcast, how Maiden, when they're playing festivals, they're headlining, they're packing out stadiums and arenas, whereas Priest might be on a festival bill, maybe 3rd or 4th from the headliners. They'll play smaller venues and things of that sort. You look at Maiden's last 5 albums, they've all gone top 10 in the US as well, which is something that was pretty rare for their 80s stuff. Their 80s stuff would typically go top 10 in the UK, but not so much in the US. They'd sell a lot more albums back then than they do now. Like their albums would go platinum in the US, which we look at Priest, their last platinum selling album, I think was Turbo back in 86. On that point though, I mean, Priest did have some success with Firepower. That also hit number 3 on the US chart, which is not necessarily always a direct correlation with album sales. Like it's easy to get to, not easy, but it's one thing to get to the chart on one week, but then typically by week 2, it's down at number 87 or something like that because the album sales just aren't consistent enough. But what do you think that is? I mean, both of these bands perhaps got back together. With Maiden's case, it was around 1999. Rob Halford came back to Priest in 2003. both of these bands had an incredible legacy, 20 plus years worth of content at that point. Both of them legends in the world of heavy metal, but Maiden went one way and Priest kind of stagnated.
Yeah. So why that is, boy. So I would say, I don't know. It might have to do with Eddie. It might have to do with the athleticism of the stage show. Bruce, I worked for Banger Films. There was a nice Banger movie about them flying around, you know, the story
Ed
of the
Force
plane.
One. Yeah.
You know, they are certainly one generation younger, definitely, like a good solid generation younger. So they do have more gas in the tank. And yeah, something about Priest might just seem more overtly heavy metal. You know, personally, I've always said this. I mean, I think literally across all of rock and roll, maybe not all music, because I don't know much outside of rock and roll, but across all of rock and roll, I think that run of Priest albums in the 70s is matched only by the run of Queen albums in the 70s as pure, unadulterated, objective genius, right? Maiden never had anything like that. Maiden have a distinct sound, and that's good. But they were essentially a punky version of Judas Priest. They never were a massive reinvention of wow, these guys are geniuses, right? They have a sound, and they invented that sound, and it's a modest invention, and then they kept that sound forever. They've never changed, which is kind of cool, because they literally sound exactly like the same new wave of British heavy metal band they always were.
Yeah.
So I guess what I'm getting around to is now I want to put down Priest's catalog a little, because I think Priest's catalog, they tried a bunch of different things, and basically, like, I remember like it was yesterday, like soon as they put out British Steel, that's the moment we thought they were mortals again, right? They weren't immortal. They weren't absolutely the smartest people on the planet in making heavy metal. Soon as we heard Living After Midnight as an advanced single with those Louie Louie chords, and you know, and the rest of it being dumbed down, right? We called it their Kiss album, right? So soon as they put that album out, they became mortals. And then they tried a bunch of different things, and they had some not great albums along the way. And definitely Maiden has had some not great albums along the way too. But I guess what I'm getting at is, starting at British Steel, they've probably had 4 or 5 different styles, and none of them were knock it out of the park styles. When Maiden stayed with their same style. But, you know, to give you the short answer, it's probably Eddie and merchandising and that logo and t-shirts.
Yeah, they probably just have better branding, probably all it comes down to. But with respect to, you did say Judas Priest, you know, have been an overtly heavy metal band. However, they have dabbled in different styles. And of course, the most obvious example of that was 1986 Turbo album, and tracks like Turbo Lover, and the use of synths and the more pop sounding sort of sensibilities that came along with that album. And it's probably a question that Priest fans don't want to think about, but if that album had been way more, you know, wildly successful than it was, and it did okay, it did go platinum in the States, not so much in the UK, would they have just doubled down on that stuff and become a quasi pop rock band in the name of being more commercial? Because they did have their sort of forays with more commercial sounds, and it's, you know, it didn't quite work out for them. So they kind of went back to metal, and Painkiller was just a massive sort of return to form. But it's just a curious one, because Maiden have typically, as you said, stayed true to their sound, whereas Priest have always dabbled and said, maybe let's go over here and try this sort of pop sound and see what happens then. Like, what do you think about Priest potentially going off in that
definitely
direction?
Because KK definitely always had a chip on his shoulder about not being, you know, the triple and 4 times platinum band, right? You know, you think of Ozzy, Scorpions was doing well, but Scorpions never did any bigger than Priest, really. But Ozzy certainly did, and AC/DC continued to do well and stuff. So there were bands always around that were doing better, and that always bothered them. Yes, with more commercial success of Turbo, they would have. But that would, for those guys, it would have had to have come with the fans not complaining as well. I mean, if I almost think that if Turbo did a fair bit better, but everybody still hated Priest. And the fans, all the old fans were still complaining, they probably would have gone back, right? Because they do have metal in their blood, sort of thing, right? Yeah. They came well, they were, like I say, I mean, they're literally, other than Sabbath and Deep Purple and Uriah Heep, with those 4 albums in 1970 inventing heavy metal, like, no one has done more for heavy metal in terms of like really contributing to it on a creative level than Sad Wings, Sin After Sin, Stained Class, and Killing Machine / Hellbent for Leather. Like those are like the cornerstones of we can all talk about albums we like more, but on an objective level, if you took out a slide rule and a calculator and punched in, you'd go, oh yeah, these are clearly the best ones.
Absolutely. And even just the look that which I mean has its origins in the world of S&M culture and whatnot. But when you think heavy metal and like that classic look, the studs, the leather, the chains, all that sort of stuff, Priest were essentially the originators of that sort of style. But to your point about the Turbo album and how Priest would have eventually gone back because they have heavy metal in their blood, I guess it's one parallel I can think of is perhaps Megadeth in 97 when they did the Cryptic Writings album, which was a lot more poppy. They had that big single in Trust. That was actually a reasonably successful album for them at the time, particularly given the musical landscape then, which was more alternative rock and whatnot. But still, 3 years later, they went back. They did The World Needs a Hero, which was a return to form. It was a more thrashy sounding album. So maybe it would have been the same for Priest if Turbo was even more successful, but they would have just I suppose gone back to what they do best.
Yeah, and at the same time, they're also like, looking at thrash doing quite well, and the excitement around this band, Metallica and Slayer and Megadeth, well, all the big four, Anthrax. So and then Pantera, they do the tour with Pantera supporting. They're inspired by that. So they're metal guys. They're looking around, and it's like and maybe they even saw the writing on the wall eventually. By the time there's a 3-year gap there, right? So you get up to ram it down. Maybe the writing is almost on the wall there, and they're noticing that the hair metal thing isn't doing so great. Although, granted, by that point, you've got Guns N' Roses doing amazing, Cinderella, Poison, Skid Row doing amazing, Slaughter doing okay, right?
Yeah. And I think KK in the podcast, we have him saying something about touring with thrash bands and seeing all this sort of heavy stuff going on and wanting to crank it up. And it's funny though, in retrospect, like he talks about the Painkiller album and he says, we inspired bands to think louder, to think faster and whatnot. But by 1990, when Painkiller came along, there was no shortage of bands out there being even heavier and fast. I mean, you already had the burgeoning sort of death metal movement at that point, and bands like Death had, released, Leprosy and like really heavy albums. But maybe it's a bit of revisionist history on the part of KK's.
Yeah, and I really I've never been a big fan of Painkiller. I know a lot of younger Priest fans think it's a masterpiece. It's way up the list. I did a book years ago, Top 500 Heavy Metal Albums of All Time, where I took a big poll to come up with the results. And I think Painkiller might have at that point been considered the greatest Priest album, and which is floors me. But the thing that bothers me, I guess, about it is and I've always felt this a little bit about their lyrics moving on, and they're just too much about metal and too kind of, primary colored, amateurish, just all about, between the hammer and the anvil and all that stuff. Like they just bought way into too much of that metal god stuff, I think.
Fair enough. I mean, I'm probably one of those younger fans who loves that album, but what about the title track? What are your thoughts on the title track, Martin?
Yeah, with that histrionic vocal, I don't know. It's almost like a King Diamond vocal on that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't really want to hear them doing thrash, frankly. I don't think, being an old school guy coming from the 70s with them and still appreciating them in the early 80s. I didn't really want to hear them doing that. Yeah, it just seemed too over the top, like it's trying too hard to be young and all that kind of stuff, right?
Fair enough. Well, let's change gears. One thing we do cover in the podcast is the legendary or landmark rather court case back in 1980. 1989/1990 that Priest were embroiled with. This was around the deaths or the suicides of two teenagers. Well, one was 18, the other was 20, in 1985. And of course, Priest were accused, and their record label was accused of putting subliminal messages in these albums that encouraged people to kill themselves. And of course, as history would have it, the judge found Priest and CBS not guilty, so they should. But Glenn Tipton basically went on to say that this was a landmark decision because if Priest had lost, then it would have made things a lot harder for creators, be they musicians, artists, journalists, authors, you name it, to put out content. And what are your thoughts on that sentiment, Martin?
Yeah, I suppose it would. And with them though, it was more of it wasn't like fake backmasking or intentional backmasking. It was literally just the song Beyond the Realms of Death being played, right? Yeah. And the forward moving message on it. So it wasn't either kind of backmasking to go with that one, right? Which is kind of odd. So, at that point you're almost like going, well, but I guess the I think the more salient point that those guys made is that well, they made 2 points. They said, well, where were the parents? The parents should have helped them out. It's kind of their fault, right? So that's what I think one point they made. The other point they made, which I think is a deeper point, is that, they didn't frame it this way, but we as metalheads could frame it this way, is that well, the way they put it was basically that our music didn't kill them. Our music was what was keeping them alive, right? And so as metalheads and people into goth or whatever, you could say, well, sad music is actually consoling, and it's odd to think of it that way. It's not sensible, but it keeps you alive, and it's what keeps you going. And then you see other people have these problems and you can commiserate with them and stuff like that. So I think that's the deeper point. It's like literally, that music, our music was one of the joys in their life, and keeping them alive. And even if it was a sad song that was kind of about suicide, it was still kind of what was keeping them alive. So our music didn't kill them. It's the other way around, even though, you can kind of argue both ways, right? Really, really sad art about suicide and stuff could spur you on to suicide, right?
Yeah, well, some kids get bullied as teenagers, and it becomes it actually destroys their sort of self-esteem well into adulthood, whereas other kids get bullied in childhood and that lights a fuse, and they're like, well, I'm going to show the world who I really am. And then they just have this sort of chip on their shoulder, and they go on to start a genre defining heavy metal band or something like that. And I suppose it's similar here. The music, you find what you look for in something, whether it's music, whether it's a book, whether it's a relationship, whatever it is. And I guess these guys found suicide in the music. But the point you make is a very salient one, because for me, I've been a metalhead now 27 years, and it's always been the one constant in my life. When things are kind of shitty, it's like, let's listen to some metal, let's go to a gig and get into the pit and just let loose and forget about life. And it doesn't matter what the lyrics are about. And even having said that, the lyrics typically, depending on which band you're listening to, while there is this association with, suicide and dark themes and whatnot, so many metal bands out there are about empowering the listener. Like Pantera's music to me was very empowering. And then you have, the genre of hardcore, which some might argue is not really metal. It's kind of like an offshoot, but bands like Hatebreed, I listen to Hatebreed in the gym. That makes me feel like I am going to just take on the world and I've got this armor on me. Never do I listen to a metal band and just feel depressed listening to it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and it's very motivational for sure, but I mean, it's called entertainment for a reason, right? I mean, it's literally there to actually entertain you. It's built into the name of it, right? But I guess the point is, in most cases, it will be a positive thing, but it's not always going to be a positive thing, right?
Absolutely. A tool is only as good as how you use it. So we've mentioned KK a few times in the conversation today, Martin, and of course, KK, he's been out of Priest now for about 12 years, left the band in 2011. He's obviously gone on to start KK's Priest with Tim Ripper Owens, also formerly of Judas Priest. I mean, what are your thoughts on this? To me, this, these guys are now, well into their 70s in some cases, and you would think the emotional intelligence and everything would be there so that they wouldn't have squabbles over such things and egos getting in the way. I mean, I'd really love to see these guys just perform their final few years together. Obviously, Glenn Tipton's got his challenges with Parkinson's disease, so nothing can be done there. But in the case of KK, he should be in Priest. They should be together touring. I mean, to see, I saw Priest live a couple of years ago. Actually, it was pre-COVID on the Download tour it was literally just Rob Halford and Ian Hill. Like, it doesn't feel like Priest anymore, really. It feels like kind of like some kind of a cover band, or I don't know. I mean, what are your thoughts on KK being out of the band, and are they all just crying over spilt milk at this point in their careers?
Yeah, I think, we forget that there's also Jane and, Bill Kerbishley and the management in there too, right? So there's that part of the movable pieces here too. So, but yeah, it's like, and you don't really, I've never really seen a lot of animosity, but I guess he hides it well between maybe Halford and KK, right? And then obviously KK said some things or whatever, but yeah, sure. I mean, from a management point of view, I mean, they should realize that obviously it's the best thing to do is get KK back in there. It's good for business. And KK seems perfectly willing to do it. So yeah, it's he definitely should be back in the band. And you've got that Andy Sneap piece there that is he keeps coming out all the time saying, I'm not in this band, I'm not really a member and all that. So so KK would look great up there, and get Mantis from Venom in there, and you've got the Three Musketeers, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And
imagine that. Go out as a six piece with three guitarists, and it's Richie, KK, and Mantis, right? The three long-haired blonde guys, right?
Matt, that's true to form. We we're talking about Judas Priest's iconic look earlier, and that would be a great way to wrap it up. But speaking of Tim Ripper Owens, now obviously he put out those two albums, Jugulator and Demolition, with Priest in the late 90s, early 2000s. They were on the label SPV, which went bankrupt in 2009. And Priest's management, or depending on who you ask, will say that this is the reason why you can't find these two albums on Spotify or major streaming services. Whereas Ripper's not so sure about that. He seems to think that he's just been erased from Judas Priest's history. He wasn't invited along to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction ceremony last year either. Me personally, I think he has his place in history, in Priest history. I think he should be acknowledged. I think those albums should be on streaming services. What are your thoughts, Martin, on this sort of?
Yeah, it doesn't make sense. They, SPV, Steamhammer, and they were out in the States too. So yeah, it doesn't seem like there's any major hurdles why they shouldn't be out. I think they should be part of the history. They are part of the history. They're not nearly as bad as Virtual 11 and the X Factor. They're just a different type of music that I don't particularly like, but they're very professionally put together. So they're not like really wobbly like those two Maiden albums from the same period. So I think they should be part of the history, and I think they could have woven them even a little more into the DNA. And a lot of fans would be talking if Rob Halford was singing a song or two over the ensuing years from those albums, just to bring him into the family.
Yeah.
Why not? You could find some good material or enough. And like I say, with the internet age the way it is, the fans would love that. They'd be talking nonstop about that. There'd be YouTube clips all over the place. So yeah, I think they should be. Whether he should have gone to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, I would say no, because that's a kind of a tricky thing where they really try to rein in how many members are part of that whole thing. So it wouldn't really be that appropriate. I don't think he's really quite right on the cusp of the edge of you should have gone sort of thing. I think he's a little more to the left. Fair enough. There are some good songs that Halford could play from that era, like Burning Howl or Metal Messiah. They were crowd pleasing songs, I think. But we did talk earlier about. I can't picture how a single one of them goes.
Yeah.
I literally can't. I can't play a single one of them in my head right now.
Well, I've got them in my head because I actually saw Ripper in Melbourne a couple of weeks ago with his solo project. It was actually kind of cool. He was in a tiny little venue called the Bendigo Hotel. There was probably about 100 people there, just a sweaty venue. And, Ripper's got a phenomenal voice. So to see him play these Priest songs in this tiny little venue was something else. But on the post sort of 2000 era, where these bands got together, we already kind of touched on the fact that Maiden's been a lot more commercially successful since Bruce came back to the band than Priest have been. But to me, apart from, say, maybe Brave New World, well, definitely Brave New World, love that album, maybe Dance of Death, a lot of the stuff Maiden's done since then, and this is my own personal opinion, kind of boring, like lots of long, epic, quote unquote, epic tracks, 12, 13 minutes. They record everything at once live, so it doesn't have that sort of quality production value that some of the earlier stuff has. Whereas Priest stuff, particularly Firepower, like that, to me, that was a great heavy metal album. And so many metal fans that I speak to in my generation, they're all like, yeah, man, Priest's later stuff compared to Maiden's later stuff, much better. Like, where do you sit on their later material?
Yeah, I'm kind of feeling that way as well. Maiden have stuck to their guns, and there's a lot of good songs across all of those albums. And I'm just like any old school Maiden fan. I don't like the long, repetitious, kind of boring, mid-pacey kind of things that they do. But there's some firecrackers across all of those. It's commendable that both bands continue to make new music. It's, not that I'm a fan of Nostradamus, but it's kind of cool that it exists in there. It's just this weird double album. And even Redeemer of Souls is kind of quirky and obscure. It's got this, I always talk about, the production on that has got a Glenn Tipton Baptism of Fire, Nostradamus, Redeemer of Souls production values, right? It's kind of a weird, almost like industrial sort of thing that he does there. And they got rid of that for Firepower, but it's kind of neat that that's there on that album as well. Angel Retribution had some good stuff as well. But yeah, I guess if you add it up, I guess Maiden's been probably more busy over those years, right? Probably a few more albums for them. So it's great that they're doing that, but yeah, it's like, if we can, paint one sort of bright spot for Priest, way up here at the end, it's 1-0, it's 1-0 Priest in terms of matching up the last two albums.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. And I think the probably wrap up with one question, which most metalheads find very difficult to answer. But if you had to pick one of these bands, Martin, you're sent away to a deserted island, you can only take the back catalog of either Maiden or Priest to listen to for all eternity, which band would it be?
Wow. That's usually a pretty easy one, but yeah, the funny thing with this is, see, Maiden, you'd have more time playing a lot of music that you're not already bored of and like the back of your hand, because there are all those long songs, right? There's so much in them, and you're usually turning them off after a few minutes or going on to the next one, right? And I guess the catalogs are roughly the same size now. Maybe Maiden's is a couple albums longer. I don't know.
They're like, Maiden has 18, Priest has 17, okay. I believe.
Oh wow, okay, so really close. And then Priest had the long head start. They started in 74 with the albums, right? And we got to remember, Priest started in 69, right? And Maiden is sort of starts in 75. So it is exactly one rock and roll generation, everything apart. Boy, I think I'd probably have to go with Priest, just because I really worship. I love a lot of Maiden albums a lot too, but I think there's just more in Priest, more flavors, more rainbows of moods across those albums. More you think of this kind of 80s and Turbo, and you think of what they did later and the Weird Ripper thing, and then the quite a lot of variety of the later stuff, and then how immense those early ones are, how great they all are. So yeah, I think I'm gonna have to go Priest.
Fair enough. I think if I had to pick, I'd probably say Maiden, and that's probably just because I listened to them for a good 5 years before I got into Priest, and so they probably appeal to the 13-year-old me in some way. And I think the bands you first get into when you're like 12, 13, 14 years old, they have this soft spot. They command a place in your heart, and it's hard to get rid of them. Like for me, Maiden, Kiss as well. It's hard to shake them, even though I don't think their material in retrospect has anything on most metal bands that I listen to now. But having been one of the first bands you get into, you always kind of say, yeah, Kiss, Van Halen, Iron Maiden, all these bands.
It's funny though, Steve. I think I did one of my podcast episodes. I think I made this point in one of them, but if I was to make a list of my favorite 10 new wave of British heavy metal albums, right?
Mm-hmm.
I could make the most boring list you could possibly imagine. I actually did it. And I remember posting this on Facebook. I wouldn't be completely left or like lying to myself if my top 10 new wave of British heavy metal albums, 7 of them were either Def Leppard or Iron Maiden. Like that's how much command Iron Maiden had through the new wave British heavy metal. Like you could put all 5 of those first Maiden albums. Is it 5? Let's see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, 5 if you allow the new wave of British heavy metal to go to 1984, which I did when I did my new wave of British heavy metal trilogy books. But so yeah, Maiden all the way through Power Slave are 5 of the greatest, you know. So if you fill it with a bunch of obscurities and stuff, right? That's when you go, oh, you're just being a record snob and putting those in. If you really like shone the big spotlight on these records, you know, the sensible person would literally put 5 Iron Maiden albums in their top 10 new wave of British heavy metal albums, you know, and I would have no problem putting On Through the Night, High and Dry, and even Pyromania in there as well. So like 8. I could literally almost put 8 in. Maybe not Pyromania. You know, I love a bunch of other new wave British heavy metal albums, and I've done lists before where, you know, it's more variety. But that's the funny thing is like a true list would be really, really ridiculously boring.
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, just speaking of the new wave of British heavy metal, there has been for the last few years, I suppose, a bit of a resurgence going on with that sort of sound and a whole new class of bands coming through, oftentimes from Sweden of all places, which just happens to have this sort of assembly line going on, pumping out great hard rock and heavy metal bands these days. But like bands like ENCORE from Sweden, Air Raid from the US, just going back to those 80s production values as well, and style and sensibility and everything else. Have you been following these bands? I imagine you have. And like, what are your thoughts on that sort of resurgence, Martin?
Yeah, I kind of don't need Pete Pardo and I on Sea of Tranquility did a whole episode on retro bands, right? And I'm not a big retro band guy, but actually I wanted to go back to something you said earlier that I want to take umbrage with. Okay. You loosely called Priest a new wave of British heavy metal band, and I know you know what you mean by that, and you could nuance that answer. Yeah. But it's funny, I get in these arguments all the time with a certain little clutch of bands that are they not new wave British heavy metal bands? And those are always, to my mind, the ones that are up for contention are Motorhead, Gillan, and Ozzy Osbourne, right? But often you will get a lot of people who want to slide Priest in there, and I'm like always, nope, they can't be. That it's just too ridiculously massive catalog before the whole thing ever started.
Makes sense.
Blah, 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 and all that, right? But yeah, it's funny. I mean, if you want to start a flame war on Facebook, like just call Motorhead a new wave British heavy metal band and see what happens, right?
Yeah,
it's
well,
bizarre.
I don't think strongly enough about that to disagree, Martin. So I'll take you on that one. And of course, you're absolutely right. Like they had 4 albums before the new wave of British heavy metal movement really came along. So it's hard to lump them into that. Whereas Maiden clearly were part of that generation. But
the great thing they did is they called an album British Steel. Like it's perfect, right? It's just like literally here we are. They codified the look, like you say. They were right in there. They were young enough that they were kind of like, I call Priest a second generation metal band, right? They were young enough that they were in there and kind of leading the whole thing as not super elders, but they weren't one of the baby bands either.
Yeah, that makes sense. And before we go, Martin, I just wanted to plug some of the work you're doing. You've also got a podcast of your own called History in 5 Songs. What can you tell our audience about that?
Yeah, so I've been going for 204 episodes every week, never missed a week. It's about a half hour. We put in 5 30-second clips. I usually just come up with a theme and illustrate that theme with these 5 examples. Usually try to have categories and a bunch of honorable mentions and extras of the whole thing. So yeah, it's just, it tends to, and lean heavy metal, prog, punk, classic rock, because I'm old. But yeah, lot of hard rock, lot of old dad heavy metal, right, in it. But yeah, just come up with a wacky theme that I can make a point, using 5 songs to make that point.
Awesome. Well, I'll add a link to the show notes for our listeners to check out History in 5 Songs, and any books in the works that our audience should be across.
Yeah, lots coming. I just did a panel book that came out a couple days ago on The Cure, but we've got another panel book coming out on Blue Oyster Cult soon. I've got The Who Quadrophenia, beautiful coffee table book coming out on 50 years of Quadrophenia. And what else has come out lately? AC/DC at 50, Bowie at 75. I've got Kiss at 50 coming out in about a year, or no, actually it's later this year. Yeah, always stuff in the works, and it's all at Martin. Anything that's in print is at martinpopoff.com. I sign them, ship them out from my office here in Toronto. There's PayPal buttons for everything.
Awesome. Well, it sounds like you're still maintaining that cadence of 3 to 4 books a year, which is great to see. So yeah, if people want to check out your other books and just learn more about you, connect with you online, they can head over to martinpopoff.com. You're also on Twitter is it Martin Popoff?
Yeah, I don't use my Twitter very much. I'm good on Facebook. It's the only thing I'm good at. But yeah, you can find me. I have been on Twitter for a long time. I just don't use it that much. But I'm a Facebook demon, that's for sure.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Martin. Really enjoyed geeking out with you on Maiden versus Priest. And I'll close out this episode by saying, as a Maiden fan, up the irons.
Absolutely.
Cheers, Martin. All right, man. We are done. Thanks so much for